Good evening and thank you. I'm wearing this tonight because if we were sitting here 100 years ago, we all would have been wearing these tonight. This was 100 years ago. This city and the rest of the country and the rest of the world were in the midst of the most deadly epidemic in world history in modern times, the most deadly epidemic since the Black Plague of the Middle Ages. It was called the Spanish flu. It didn't come from Spain. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but most people know me for this book, which is called Don't Know Much About History. I wrote it 30 years ago when I was a very small child, and nobody knew me. I didn't have academic credentials. I wasn't famous, but I loved history, and I loved to think about history and talk about it. And so I wrote a book that was really asked basic questions about history. What did Columbus really discover? What does the Declaration of Independence declare? Why is there a statue of Benedict Arnold's boot in Saratoga, New York? If you're curious, I'll let you know the answer to that later on. But what I discovered was that it was at the time when people said Americans don't know much about history, we're really ignorant about history, and I could never understand that because as a kid, I always loved history. History to me isn't dates and battles and speeches, it's stories of real people doing real things in real places. I grew up in Mount Vernon, New York, just north of New York City, and I was very lucky. My parents took us every summer, our vacations, we couldn't afford hotels, so we threw old Army surplus sleeping bags and tents in the car, and we'd go to places like Gettysburg and Valley Forge and Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. So I always had the sense that history isn't something that just happens in books. History is something that happens to real people in real places. And I've spent 30 years talking about history, most importantly about connecting the past to the present. That's the problem a lot of kids have in school and a lot of us still have. What does what happened 50 or 150 years ago or 500 years ago have to do with me today? And that's what I've kind of focused on throughout my career in writing about history. But most of all, I've tried to make it about real people, to make it human, to make it not just a long list of facts that kids remember for the date. I often talk about these are the stories that our school books leave out, our textbooks leave out. And my most two recent books are perfect examples of that in some respects. This one is called In the Shadow of Liberty, and it's the story of slavery in America. But I wrote it from the perspective of 5 people who were owned by some of our most famous presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Jackson. When you see slavery, which we often think about in terms of words like abolition and emancipation and constitutional amendments, when you see slavery through the human face that I try and put on it, it becomes much more real, much more important. And what I've tried to do is explain how important slavery is throughout American history. This country grew in part because of slavery, in large part because of slavery. It was written into our Constitution. It was the foundation on which great fortunes were built in this country. And its legacy is with us today, which is why I wrote this book. And by the way, you can see this is a photograph, a daguerreotype, an early type of photograph. This is a man who was owned by Thomas Jefferson. Now think about that for a minute. We have a picture of a man named Isaac Jefferson who was owned by Thomas Jefferson. That's how close we are to this story. This didn't happen 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago. It happened recently enough that we have a photograph of a man who was owned by the author of the Declaration of Independence. So I try and focus on these human stories when I write about history. More recently, as I mentioned with my flu mask on, I wrote the story of the Spanish flu. A lot of people haven't heard of the Spanish flu. It killed more Americans, 675,000 Americans, in about the space of 1 year. That's more Americans than died in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and Korea put together. That's about the number of Americans that have died from HIV and AIDS in 40 years. This was in 1 year. It was an astonishing thing that happened while we were fighting World War I. So you had these two twin catastrophes. About 100,000 American soldiers died in World War I. Maybe 40,000 of them actually died of the flu. And of course, many more people died of the flu worldwide than died from the war. Probably 100 million people in the space of a year. The strange thing is that this extraordinary event in our history got written out of the history books. Most people have never heard of the Spanish flu. I'll just tell you a quick story about the Spanish flu, why it's called the Spanish flu. Spain was a neutral country during World War I, so they didn't censor the press. The first reports of an unusual epidemic came out of Madrid, and so everyone started to call it the Spanish flu. It actually started in the United States in army bases. Fort Riley in Kansas was the first recorded account. A cook walks into the infirmary one morning and says he's got the flu symptoms. They quarantined him. He, of course, had been serving food to hundreds of men. By the end of the day, 75 guys are sick. By the end of the week, 500 guys are sick. These are young, healthy, strapping farm boys, and they were on their backs flat. They were turning blue. They couldn't breathe. Their lungs were filling up with fluid. That's one of the reasons before they called it the Spanish flu, they called it the Purple Death. There's no question that these soldiers then got on trains and got on boats and took that flu virus to Europe. 1 million American soldiers land in France in the spring of 1918, and this thing explodes around the world. It's an extraordinary story, and it's too important not to know about because it teaches us a lot about, it teaches us lessons that we can learn from today. One of the lessons is that fear and propaganda are very dangerous. Another lesson is because people believed that the Germans were responsible for the flu. That was the front page newspapers in 1918. People were actually dying, falling down dead in the streets of New York and Philadelphia and Boston, across the country. They were stacked like cordwood, they would say. And they believed that the Germans had somehow poisoned the water supply. And that was the news reports that were going out. So fake news was around 100 years ago. There was another important part of this, which is that good medical sound advice and science was ignored. Perhaps the best example of that I can give you is that in September of 1918, Philadelphia was going to give a parade. Now back in those days, we paid for wars by selling war bonds. They were called Liberty Loans. And Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks and all the most famous people in Hollywood were all out making movies to sell these war bonds. They gave a parade in Philadelphia, even though the health department knew that the flu virus was around. 200,000 people are in the streets of Philadelphia, September 28th, 1918. 3 days later, every hospital bed in Philadelphia was filled. 3 weeks later, 12,000 people were dead of the flu. Last year we had a bad flu season, 80,000 people died. So in Philadelphia, the medical authorities knew how dangerous this was, but they let this parade go on because they had a bigger agenda, which was to sell war bonds. General Pershing and Woodrow Wilson were told not to allow men to go over to Europe as the war was winding down in the last months of September and October in 1918, but they wanted more troops to defeat the Germans. So they put these men on ships, sent them over, and those ships became floating coffins. Not everyone died, of course. There were some lucky survivors, many lucky survivors. There was a kid named Walt in Chicago. He tried to become a soldier. He was too young, so he became a Red Cross ambulance driver. He got really sick with the flu, was sent home. His mother nursed him back, almost died. His name was Walt Disney. A young man who was over in Europe as the Undersecretary of the Navy toured around the battlefields and picked up the flu and came back on a boat that was notorious for carrying flu passengers. He was so sick when he got to New York, they put him in an ambulance, took him to his mother's house on Fifth Avenue here in New York, and he was nursed back to health. But it was very touch and go for a while. His name is Franklin D. Roosevelt. So just imagine how the world would have changed if Walt Disney and Franklin D. Roosevelt hadn't survived the Spanish flu. These are the kind of stories I like to tell, to put this into context, to make it human, to make it real for us today. It's not just a long list of dates and battles and speeches, and it proves that your history class might have been a little boring back there in high school, but history is not boring when we talk about it as real stories of real people. So thanks for inviting me in. It was a great pleasure to talk to you. Usually I get to talk for an hour, and so it's very hard to me to cut myself off. But I should also mention that John and I didn't recognize each other tonight, because usually we see each other very early on Tuesday morning, and we are usually in spandex cycling outfits, and we work out together, and so we didn't recognize each other tonight in our civvies. So thanks very much, John, for inviting me in. A pleasure to meet you. I'll just mention again, if you're interested in more about my books or my work, don'tknowmuch.com is the best way to find out about me. I write there. I try and connect history to the headlines, find interesting things that are going on, interesting dates and anniversaries in history that we should be paying attention to. And I think I'll just close on this. This is not just a matter of knowing some interesting trivia and knowing what happened in the past. We are really at an unusual moment, not only in American history, but in world history. Democracy is really under attack around the world. And that's an astonishing thing for me to recognize and realize. When 44 senators, former senators, write a letter and talking about this is an inflection point in our history, it's really important that we understand our rights and our responsibilities, because democracy is not a spectator sport. And that's really one of the messages I'm trying to get out, not only to adults, but to kids as well. So thank you very much for hearing me out.